January 5th, 1943. The Solomon Islands. Aboard the light cruiser USS Helena, gun crews stared into the sky as Japanese Val dive bombers peeled off into their attack runs. For years, hitting a fast-moving plane with an artillery shell was a matter of sheer luck, often taking thousands of rounds for a single elimination. But this time was different. The gunners loaded a top-secret new shell, a weapon so revolutionary it was guarded more closely than the atomic bomb. They were about to witness firsthand how one civilian's impossible discovery made every U.S. bomb 100 times more deadly. The story of this revolutionary weapon begins not with a flash of genius, but with a roar of utter failure. In the early 1940s, the world was witnessing a terrifying evolution in the art of war. The 1930s, often called the golden age of aviation, had produced aircraft of breathtaking speed and power. The clumsy, slow-moving biplanes of the First World War were relics of a bygone era, replaced by sleek, all-metal monoplanes with cantilevered wings, enclosed cockpits, and immensely powerful engines like the British Rolls-Royce Merlin and the German Daimler-Benz DB 601. Aircraft like the Supermarine Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, and the Mitsubishi A6M0 could climb faster, fly higher, and maneuver with an agility that was previously unimaginable. They had become the ultimate offensive weapon, capable of striking deep into enemy territory and delivering devastating payloads with pinpoint accuracy. For the soldiers and sailors on the ground and at sea, this new reality was a constant nightmare. The primary defense against this aerial threat was anti-aircraft artillery, a discipline that had changed little in principle since its inception. The strategy was one of brute force and overwhelming volume. The idea was to create a wall of steel, a dense barrage of exploding shells in the predicted path of an enemy formation. The hope was that the enemy pilots, through sheer bad luck, would fly into this cloud of deadly shrapnel. The grim reality, however, was that these walls were mostly empty space. On the deck of a warship, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Men shouted orders over the deafening roar of the guns. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burnt cordite. Gunners, drenched in sweat, frantically spun polished brass wheels to traverse and elevate the heavy gun barrels, their eyes fixed on mechanical dials that tried to solve an impossible math problem in real time. The U.S. Navy's 5-inch .38 caliber gun, a superb weapon by any standard, could hurl a 55-pound shell over 9 miles, but its effectiveness was entirely dependent on hitting a target that was itself moving at hundreds of miles per hour. This was the core of the failure, the prediction problem. Hitting a distant, maneuvering aircraft with a shell is a three-dimensional race against time and physics. It required calculating the target's speed, altitude, and direction, then forecasting its exact position in the sky several seconds into the future. It was like trying to hit a thrown baseball with another baseball, but from 100 yards away and while standing on a moving platform. The slightest jink of the pilot's controls, a sudden gust of wind, or a minuscule error in the complex mechanical calculators used for targeting was enough to make the difference between a near miss and an actual hit. To detonate their shells, gunners had only two crude options. The first was the impact fuse. This was simple and brutally effective against a static target, but against an aircraft, it demanded a direct hit, a feat of marksmanship so rare as to be almost mythical. The second, more common method was the timed fuse. This was a miniature clockwork mechanism inside the shell's nose. Before firing, the gun crew would use a special wrench to set the fuse to detonate after a specific number of seconds. The goal was to have the shell burst at the predicted altitude of the enemy aircraft, creating a spray of shrapnel. In practice, this was a guessing game. A savvy pilot, seeing the dark puffs of smoke from a previous salvo, could easily change altitude, ensuring the next volley of shells would detonate harmlessly in empty air, hundreds of feet above or below him. The events of the Blitz in London and the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor laid the crisis bare for all to see. The defenses were simply not working. Official statistics from 1941 painted a bleak and startling picture. On average, it took a staggering 16,000 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy plane. The expenditure in ammunition was colossal. The results, negligible. Gunners were firing themselves deaf, throwing up veritable mountains of ammunition, only to watch enemy bombers fly through their barrages seemingly untouched. The Allies were facing a technological dead end. They needed more than a better gun or a more powerful explosive. They needed a quantum leap. They needed a shell that could think for itself. But a solution was coming from a place no one expected. The miracle the Allies so desperately needed was not forged in a government arsenal or conceived in a military war college. Its unlikely birthplace was a quiet, requisitioned administrative building in Washington, D.C., known as the Pumphrey Mansion. It was here that civilian science was drafted for war on an unprecedented scale. In the summer of 1940, as the world watched the fall of France, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man who deeply understood the role of technology, authorized the creation of the National Defense Research Committee, or NDRC. Its mission was to bypass traditional military bureaucracy and harness the full power of American scientific innovation. The man chosen to lead this monumental effort was Vannevar Bush, an engineer and the president of the Carnegie Institution. Bush was a visionary who knew that the conflict looming on the horizon would be a physicist's war, won by minds as much as by might. One of the most urgent problems dropped onto the NDRC's plate was the abysmal failure of anti-aircraft defense. The project was assigned to a brand new division, designated Section T. The T stood for its chairman, Merle A. Tuve. Tuve was not a weapons designer. He was a pure scientist, a 42-year-old physicist from the Carnegie Institution with a reputation for brilliant, hands-on experimentation. A plain-spoken native of South Dakota, he was known for his restless energy, his impatience with red tape, and his groundbreaking work in nuclear physics and geophysics, including proving the existence of the ionosphere. He was the epitome of Bush's dollar-a-year men, a cadre of elite civilian scientists who left their prestigious and well-paying positions to serve their country for a symbolic $1 salary. Tuve's directive was simple in its goal and staggering in its complexity. Invent a fuse that could sense its own proximity to a target and detonate automatically. The challenge was immense. While the British were exploring fuses based on light sensors, Tuve's team, which included other brilliant physicists like Lawrence Hafstad and Richard B. Roberts, settled on a far more audacious concept. They would build a complete, functioning radio transceiver, a miniature radar set, and pack it into the nose of an artillery shell. The scientific principle was elegant. The fuse would contain a tiny oscillator that emitted a continuous radio wave. When this wave struck a reflective object like an airplane, some of that energy would bounce back to a receiver in the fuse. The real genius, however, was in its use of the Doppler effect. As the shell rapidly closed the distance to the target, the frequency of the returning radio wave would be compressed, shifting higher. A specialized circuit would be designed to detect this specific frequency shift, and when the signal reached a predetermined strength, indicating the shell was within a lethal radius of about 70 feet, it would trip an electronic switch, detonating the main charge. What neither man knew in that moment was that this elegant theory was about to collide with the most brutal physical forces imaginable. The first hurdle was miniaturization. The entire apparatus had to be squeezed into a space no bigger than a large orange. The key components of the era's electronics were vacuum tubes, delicate glass bulbs containing heated filaments, and grids that were notoriously fragile. But the truly impossible challenge, the one that made military ordnance experts scoff, was surviving the gun launch. When a 5-inch naval shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to over 1,700 miles per hour in less than 20 feet. The force exerted on it is a mind-boggling 20,000 times the force of gravity. It is an instantaneous shock of unimaginable violence. To add to the chaos, the shell is spun by the rifling in the gun barrel to over 25,000 revolutions per minute to stabilize its flight, creating immense centrifugal forces. Early tests at the Dahlgren Proving Ground in Virginia were catastrophic failures. Over 90% of the prototype fuses were instantly pulverized into a useless collection of shattered glass and broken wires. Tuve's response to this overwhelming challenge became the team's rallying cry. I don't want any of you damn physicists to tell me it can't be done. The job has to be done. The labs at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, which Tuve established to run the project, became a crucible of innovation. The team essentially had to reinvent every single electronic component. They learned to suspend the tiny inner workings of the vacuum tubes in shock-absorbent materials. Sylvania, a radiotube company, was contracted to produce special, ruggedized tubes that looked less like light bulbs and more like small, solid acorns. The power source was another intractable problem. A conventional battery would have its plates torn apart by the G-forces. The solution was a stroke of genius, a reserve battery. It contained all its chemical components, but the electrolyte was stored separately in a fragile glass ampule. The battery remained inert and could be stored for years. But upon firing, the shock would shatter the ampule, releasing the electrolyte and activating the battery in a fraction of a second. To ensure safety, they designed a mercury switch that would only close the circuit when the centrifugal force of the shell's spin reached a certain level, and a separate clockwork mechanism that prevented the fuse from arming until it was a safe distance from the gun crew. It was a symphony of solutions to problems that, just months before, had been deemed unsolvable. The device worked on paper, but would it survive the real world? By the spring of 1942, after nearly 2 years of relentless and often frustrating work, Merle Tuve and the scientists of Section T had achieved the impossible. They had created a working prototype, designated the Mark 32 VT fuse. The name itself was a masterpiece of wartime deception. VT officially stood for variable time, a bland and uninformative name intended to make anyone who heard it assume it was merely an improved version of a standard clockwork fuse. Its true nature, as a radio-controlled device, was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, a secret deemed so critical that its security protocols were, in some aspects, even more stringent than those surrounding the Manhattan Project. Now, the monumental challenge shifted from invention to mass production. This was not a simple piece of ordnance. It was a complex, delicate electronic instrument that had to be manufactured with the precision of a watch, yet be rugged enough to survive a cannon launch. Millions were needed. In a decision that proved to be a stroke of genius, the primary contract was awarded not to a traditional munitions firm, but to the Crosley Radio Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio. A company that built civilian radios and refrigerators had the specific expertise in mass-producing electronics that was required. The secrecy at the Crosley plant and the dozens of other subcontractors, like Sylvania and RCA, was absolute. The factory floors were staffed largely by women, the Rosie the Riveters, who had stepped up to fill the nation's industrial needs. These women, like Anna Vantine and thousands of others, worked diligently, meticulously, soldering tiny wires and assembling components they did not understand. They were told they were making parts for new commercial radio sets that would be released after the war. The small, circular wire at the nose of the fuse, which was actually the antenna, was referred to on diagrams as a light bulb tip. These ordinary citizens, working day in and day out, had no idea they were building the key to Allied victory in the air. The logistics of getting these fuses to the front were equally fraught. They were transported under armed guard, in specially marked containers, with dire warnings about the consequences of even a single unit falling into enemy hands. The first top-secret shipment of VT fuses reached the Pacific Fleet in the late summer of 1942. The Navy, still recovering from the early blows of the war, was eager for any advantage. The combat debut came on January 5, 1943. The light cruiser USS Helena was on patrol in the Solomon Islands when a squadron of Japanese Ichid-3A Val dive bombers, the very aircraft that had wreaked so much havoc at Pearl Harbor, swooped in to attack. On the bridge of the Helena, the atmosphere was tense, but this time was different. The 5-inch gun crews were ordered to load the new VT ammunition. The ship's guns barked. As the Japanese pilots began their steep dives, something utterly baffling occurred. Long before the American shells reached them, they seemed to vanish in small black puffs of smoke. Shrapnel, as if from nowhere, tore through wings and fuselages. A valve, trailing smoke, spiraled out of control and slammed into the ocean. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant Gilbert "Red" Cochran, watched in amazement as his crews, with just a handful of salvos, brought down one of the most feared aircraft in the Japanese inventory. To the Japanese pilots, it was inexplicable and terrifying. It seemed as though the Americans had found a way to create invisible nets of destruction in the sky. The news of the Helena's success electrified the Pacific Fleet. The skepticism of old-school ordnance officers evaporated overnight, replaced by an urgent demand for as many of the magic fuses as could be produced. The statistics confirmed the anecdotal evidence. By mid-1943, VT fuse shells accounted for only a quarter of the anti-aircraft ammunition available, yet they were responsible for more than half of all enemy aircraft brought down by naval guns. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in 1944, U.S. Navy gunners, armed with VT fuses, created an almost impenetrable shield around their carriers, helping to bring down hundreds of Japanese aircraft in a single day. At Leyte Gulf, overwhelmed American destroyers used the fuse to savage Japanese air attacks, a critical factor in their heroic stand. But the ultimate test came during the brutal campaign for Okinawa in 1945. The Japanese unleashed the full fury of the kamikaze. These deliberate attacks were nearly impossible to stop with conventional fire. A plane that was hit and damaged could still complete its mission. The VT fuse changed this deadly equation. By creating a large lethal burst radius around the target, it didn't just damage the kamikaze planes, it shredded them, often causing them to disintegrate in midair. It was this leap in effectiveness, from a weapon of chance to a weapon of near certainty, that gives meaning to the 100 times more deadly claim. It turned a defensive weapon into an offensive one. As Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal later concluded, it was an ingenious device, without which the swift advance across the Pacific would not have been possible. The fuse was changing the war against planes, but a new threat was coming. While Merle Tuvey's invention was creating an impenetrable shield over the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, a new and deeply sinister threat was materializing in the skies over Great Britain. On June 13, 1944, just 7 days after the successful D-Day landings, the first of Hitler's Vergeltungswaffen, or vengeance weapons, slammed into London. It was the Fieseler Fee 103, a pilotless flying bomb known to the terrified public as the V1, the buzz bomb, or most commonly, the doodlebug. This was not an airplane. It was the world's first operational cruise missile. Launched from sites in occupied France, the V1 was a crude but terrifyingly effective weapon. Its pulse jet engine produced a distinctive sputtering roar that became one of the most dreaded sounds of the war. It flew at nearly 400 miles per hour at a low altitude of 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Too high for light anti-aircraft guns, but too low for heavy guns with timed fuses to track effectively. The psychological impact on Londoners was immense. The most terrifying moment was when the sputtering engine would suddenly cut out, a sign that the bomb was tipping into its final dive. That chilling silence, followed seconds later by a massive explosion, created an atmosphere of constant, random dread. In the first few months, over 6,000 civilians perished, and the morale of the home front was shaken. The existing defenses, organized under the code name Operation Diver, were struggling. The defense was a 3-layered system: Royal Air Force fighter patrols over the English Channel, a massive belt of anti-aircraft guns along the coast, and a final line of barrage balloons closer to London. But the V1 was a small, fast target, difficult for even the fastest Spitfires to intercept, and the gun belt was proving tragically ineffective. In this moment of profound crisis, Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced a difficult choice. The existence of the VT fuse was the Allies' most precious technological secret. Its use had been strictly forbidden over land, where a dud shell could be recovered, analyzed, and copied by German scientists. The fear of losing this decisive technological edge was paramount, but the V-1 attacks were becoming unbearable. After intense debate within the War Cabinet, Churchill made the bold decision. The risk of the secret being compromised was now less than the risk of London's spirit being broken. The fuses were to be deployed to defend the city. The order set off a frantic logistical scramble. Crates of the secret fuses were flown directly from factories in the United States to Britain in the bomb bays of Lancaster bombers. British gun crews, accustomed to the frustrations of their own equipment, were hastily retrained on how to handle and fire the American ammunition in their 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns. The results were immediate and dramatic. The coastal gun belt, which had been a porous filter, transformed into a virtual wall of death. Gunners who had once celebrated a single hit in a week were now bringing down multiple V-1s in a single day. The lethal rate soared. As the Allied armies pushed through France after D-Day, they overran the V-1 launch sites, forcing the Germans to target the vital, newly liberated port of Antwerp in Belgium, through which the majority of Allied supplies were flowing. The defense of Antwerp became the VT fuse's magnum opus in the European theater. A massive semicircle of hundreds of Allied anti-aircraft guns was established to protect the city. In the first weeks of this shield being active, the gunners brought down 48 of the first 75 V-1s that entered their engagement zone. By the end of the V-1 campaign, the fuse was credited with neutralizing thousands of the flying bombs, saving Antwerp's port and preventing a catastrophic disruption of the Allied supply chain. It was this incredible success that prompted Churchill's now famous declaration that the proximity fuse was the secret that won the war. While a general statement, it reflected the profound strategic impact of a weapon that had tamed one of the enemy's most feared innovations. The war was won, but the fuse's true story was still a secret. When the armaments of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled a collective, ragged breath and began the monumental task of processing the global struggle's sheer scale and the terrifying technological leaps it had produced. The public consciousness was gripped by stories of radar that could pierce the darkest night, jet engines that shattered records of speed, and the world-altering elemental power of the atomic device. These were the technologies that defined the period's conclusion. Yet, amid these headline-grabbing revelations, the full story of one of the era's most quietly decisive technologies remained shrouded in the highest levels of classification. It was not until 1946, a full year after the fighting had stopped, that the veil of secrecy was finally lifted from the variable time, or VT, fuse. The moment the story broke, newspapers and popular science magazines ran sensational articles, revealing to a stunned public the incredible tale of the magic fuse with a brain. It was a device, they wrote, that could think for itself. The narrative of Merrill Tuve, a brilliant and tenacious physicist from the Carnegie Institution, and his eclectic team of civilian scientists at the secret Section T of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, became a celebrated symbol of American ingenuity during that time. Tuve was rightfully awarded the Medal for Merit, the nation's highest civilian honor, and the 1,200 scientists, engineers, and technicians who toiled under his leadership received the Naval Ordnance Development Award for their collective contribution. Across the country, in towns and cities far from the laboratories of Washington, D.C., thousands of former factory workers, many of them women who had entered the workforce for the first time, read these stories and experienced a profound moment of realization. They finally understood that the delicate light bulb tips and complex radio parts they had so meticulously assembled day after day were, in fact, the thinking hearts of a revolutionary instrument that had saved countless Allied lives. The fuse's legacy was immediate, profound, and multifaceted. On the most fundamental level, it irrevocably altered the grim calculus between offensive and defensive operations. By giving anti-aircraft artillery an almost uncanny accuracy, it made the skies vastly more hazardous for attacking aircraft, tipping the scales back in favor of the defender. This core concept of a smart instrument, a projectile that could sense its environment and make a decision to activate at the most opportune moment, became the foundational principle for virtually all modern guided projectile technology. From the ship-saving RIM 7 Sea Sparrow to the air superiority AIM-9 Sidewinder, the lineage traces directly back to the principles proven inside a 5-inch naval shell. Furthermore, the immense technical challenges that Tuvey's team had solved, miniaturizing fragile radio components and ruggedizing them to survive the apocalypse of a cannon launch, laid the essential groundwork for the electronics revolution that would power the subsequent decades and the space race. But perhaps its most enduring legacy was institutional. The overwhelming success of civilian-led, government-funded, mission-oriented projects like Section T and the Manhattan Project created an entirely new paradigm for scientific research. This model led directly to the establishment of post-period titans of innovation like the National Science Foundation, NSF, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. Research Projects Agency, DARPA, cementing a permanent, powerful, and sometimes controversial partnership between science and national defense. After the period of hostility